We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey there, welcome back to the Mankind Podcast. This is Boysen Hodgson speaking. In this episode, I speak with Chris Hemmings. Chris Hemmings is a Mancunian, a person born in Manchester in the UK, and that fact alone connotes a whole lot of characteristics about how he grew up. Mancunians have a reputation. They're proud, they're scrappy, and for a young man like Chris, very much coded into a particular kind of British manhood. So in this episode, we spend time talking about the unspoken rules and the spoken rules, the expectations, the entitlement, the pain, the suffering, and some of the positive possibilities of British lad culture like that which Chris Hemmings grew up in, being a Mancunian. So we talk about our upbringing, his upbringing, what that meant. We talk about the wake-up calls to impacts in the world when we start waking up to what this programming is actually meaning to us and the people around us. We talk about the pain and suffering, the epidemic of suicide among men that this kind of culture drives and is part of. And we also have a very hopeful and compassionate conversation about the possibilities coming from this place that we each have as men to really be able to connect, reach out to other men, and to share from our own hearts. How do we change this programming? How do we work with young men? How do we do what we can to prevent violence and to change culture of masculinity? I really enjoy speaking with Chris. I hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you on the other side. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast. I am super excited today to be sitting with and getting to speak with Chris Hemmings. Chris, welcome.
Hey, Boysen.
I might ask you to move your mic just a little closer.
Sure.
Chris Hemmings is a public speaker, a broadcaster, and an author who has previously worked as a journalist for the BBC, Sky, ITV, and who's written for numerous national newspapers, including The Independent and The Telegraph. He's produced and presented documentaries for the BBC, mostly focusing on stories about men. And in 2017, he published his book, Be a Man: How Macho Culture Damages Us and How to Escape It. Today, Chris's work is focused on working with schools and organizations on empathy, healthy masculinity, and preventing male violence through culture change. He is also mid-training to become a psychotherapist. And I'll say, so I reached out to Chris because I had seen the Be a Man book cross across my screen, and I saw a couple of quick videos of Chris talking about men's violence that really sparked my interest, resonated with how I feel about the topic and how I believe MKP looks at the topic also as men's responsibility. Ending violence is men's work. So Chris, and you all don't get to see Chris, but Chris is a younger man than me. He's been around, he's in the UK. And so we're going to start with Chris. Where did you come from? Tell me a bit about your upbringing and background.
Sure. So I'm born in Manchester, which is the northwest of England. If anybody knows about Manchester, they'll know that everybody from Manchester has an excess of civic pride. So if anybody, wherever I travel around the world, if anybody ever asks me where I'm from, rather than say that I'm British or English, I say that I'm a Mancunian, that I'm from Manchester. So even though I live in London, I definitely have a kind of strong core of Manchester in me that will never leave. Just like I have this accent, by the way, that I spent 6 months in Australia, and came back somehow with a stronger Mancunian accent than when I left. So very much Mancunian. I grew up in the east of Manchester, which is right near the Pennines, in what you'd probably describe as a former industrial town. There were lots of empty cotton mills. It was where a lot of the cotton was picked by the slaves in America and was brought over to the northwest of England. Manchester, by the way, the mill workers of Manchester were the first ones who refused to process the cotton picked by slaves. So, once again, big up Manchester. So I grew up in a town that was very much post-industrial. It was... am I allowed to swear? Because it was a shithole.
Yes, please.
Good. It was a shithole. The town that I lived in. It was very much past its best. And I went to a local primary school there, but really fortunately for me, my older brother is a genius. I've got two older brothers. My older brother is a complete genius, and one of the teachers at the primary school asked my parents whether or not they'd ever thought about sending Martin, my eldest brother, to private school because he was that smart. And so because he went to private school, then my middle brother ended up going to private school, and so then I had to go to private school too. So I ended up going to private school in the centre of Manchester. And that bred a certain level of arseholery and entitlement, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. But yeah, that's kind of the basis of my upbringing. Very sporty, very sporty. I was captain of the school football team till I was 14, then I got too fat and played rugby against my will. I was also a semi-professional cricketer for a short time, and yeah, I was good at cricket. So I'm one of those guys.
Very sporty. So, and you kind of said, learned some level of assholery, which is a word that you use in your book as well, which is a fun word. Not very.
I think it's
not very US word.
I think I might have made it up.
Your assholery. So in that private school, in that dying town, and when I think of Manchester, I think of probably a number of films that I saw that all came out in the mid to late 80s that were kind of about that post-industrial England. I'm guessing some of them were filmed in Manchester and around the areas that you were.
Quite likely, yeah.
What are some of the messages that you took on about being a boy, being a man, growing up in the environment you grew up in?
Growing up in it's called Staley Bridge, the town I grew up in. The prevailing mentality of the men that were around me was one of, with the older men, it was very emotionless. With my peers, as I got into teens and slightly older, I would say it was bravado. It was what we used to call steadheads, people who took steroids, steadheads.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of that, a lot of really kind of basic displays of machismo, I would say, was around. And I really, really did not fit in with that at all. I felt extremely out of place in that town, which is why as soon as I could afford to, I left. The moment that I could afford to get out of that place, I left. Really wasn't a place that I felt comfortable in at the time. I'm sure it's different now, slightly, but it was, a lot of the bars and stuff were very fighty, very fighty. And school was very different. School was a completely different beast altogether. School was your classic private school of, again, fairly emotionless, lots of bravado, but kind of intelligent bullying and intelligent critique of each other, but a lot of one-upsmanship, and also, this is something I go into private schools now, and this is something that I talk to private schools about, is that my school used to say to us, there was this mantra that was repeated ad nauseum, which was, don't forget that you're in the top 5% in the country. Don't ever forget that you're in the top 5% in the country. And you were like, yeah, great, I'm awesome, yeah. And you realize now that causes so many problems of entitlement. And entitlement is a huge issue amongst a lot of men. And it just bred this unaware, made you unaware almost that your experience of the world wasn't the default, that you were entitled, that you were going to inherit the earth, and that you were, that you were set for life. And in many ways it's true, but in many ways that's damaging and causes those people problems who end up not being able to fulfill those expectations put on them.
Yeah. So it sounds like there was part of that was kind of innate to you, is that you didn't feel like you could meet those expectations. You did feel like fish out of water in the environment that you were in, and yet you were fairly successful in the environment as it was. Yeah.
I'm doing air quotes now.
Yeah.
Air quotes. Successful. Successful in terms of I was captain of the school football team. I played first 15 rugby because I got too fat for football. I ended up playing first 11 cricket. So success in that respect. Yeah. Was I quote successful in terms of my grades? No. I was deemed to be a failure in terms of academically, because I got a B and 2 C's at A level when everybody else was getting A's and maybe a B or something. But I had never really had any interest in academia. It wasn't where I considered my life to be going. So was I a success in the eyes of the school? No. Was I a success in the eyes of my parents? Probably not at the time. Was I a success in terms of myself? I just didn't care by then. I was beyond caring about that. I was more interested in, by that point, I was more interested in some of the disgraceful behaviors that I was getting involved in instead.
Thank you. So you talk about, and this isn't a term that we have in the U.S. so much, but you talk about lad culture. And you and I have touched on this a little bit. So some of the behaviors that you got into, I think, lead us into that. So what did it look like when you were deeply involved in that culture?
Yeah, I guess what the closest that you have in the US would be kind of like jock culture, maybe. But lad culture is actually, I guess, because jock culture is very college-based, right? So
high school, college, yeah.
High school, that's the connotation of it, right? But then lad culture is this. Think of it of the boys' club, right? Where the boys are the first rule is everybody's got each other's back. Nobody grasses on each other. If your mate's getting in a fight, you get in a fight with them. But then it gets more insidious than that. It's the behaving with impunity. It's knowing that you have this safety in numbers, that you can do what you want when you want, and you will not get in trouble for it. And it's this drinking, it's the excess, it's the bravado, it's the casual language of homophobia, misogyny, racism, violence. That's the connotation of it. That's the lad culture started really in the 90s with Manchester band Oasis and all of that, and their whole shtick was that they didn't give a fuck, right? I do what the fuck I want whenever I want, and that's my proper Mancunian accent, and that's the mentality. But actually, I think that, and I'm partly to blame for this, I think that lad culture isn't as bad as it was made out to be. I think in the same way that I no longer talk about toxic masculinity, I talk about some of the toxic aspects of masculinity. I think that lad culture has some fantastic qualities about it. It is about brotherhood. It is about sharing crazy experiences and challenging each other to do stuff that is out of your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had so much fun in those environments, so much fun. But there are aspects of it that are dangerous, and that is where the focus needs to be. And so again, I know we discussed this before, I'm very, very careful about not using demonizing language, because
good.
I think you and I both know that you can lose men like that from a conversation if you demonize. So I don't want to demonize lad culture. And actually, when I speak to young boys now, I use language like hanging out with your boys. You know, what are your lads? What are your what's your gang doing? Like, what are you up to? Like, so actually, groups of lads aren't inherently negative, but they can be seen that way. And so there are and were, and there definitely still are, some really negative things that happen in amongst lad culture, not least behaviours towards others. But there's also some wonderful, beautiful things that happen in those spaces too that are like nothing else in the world that I've ever found.
That's excellent. Thank you. So we talk about the Mankind Podcast as a space for men to learn that there's more than one way to be a man. And one of the ways that we do that is by not applying these kind of demonizing labels onto across the board, right? Let's not paint with a broad brush. Let's really peel apart what it is that's beautiful about that. You know, and you talk about it and I talk about it as well. In the book, you talk about kind of traditional masculinity and kind of the views on traditional masculinity. I think that's some of what we're talking about here. There's some real beauty in that kind of pushing each other to achieve, in that kind of challenging culture, in the kind of direction, in the kind of brotherhood that goes along with that. Right. There's some real beautiful stuff that can emerge in that that's very positive, leads to very healthy individuals.
Which is specifically why the book was about macho culture,
yes,
and not about masculinity.
Yes.
Because I don't think that there is... I really don't think there's much positive to take from machismo and macho culture. And actually, if I had my time again, I probably would have written more positive stuff about masculinity in that book. But I wasn't writing about masculinity per se. It was about macho culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that machismo that causes us problems a lot of the time.
Beautiful.
Not the more rounder concept of masculinity and being a man.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go into some of the impacts so on this negative side, on these aspects where this kind of male entitlement that we're talking about, this kind of machismo culture has impacts. When did you start waking up? What were some of the key moments that helped you start waking up to, holy shit, this is not what I want to be creating in the world?
To anybody who has heard me speak before, I apologize because you will have heard this. But there were 3 extremely key moments in my life. The first one, I'm a fresher at university, what you would call a freshman, and I am in a room of 40 shirtless, chanting men, all members of the university rugby team. And on this occasion, obviously the structure is that freshers have to obey orders, and I say obey, like of course we can choose to opt out of that mentality, but in order to socialize properly within the club, you know, you have to opt into these behaviors. And so I opted in heavily. And so on this occasion I was put on what was known as door duty. Door duty meant that if any birds, quote, and birds is a British slang for women, not a nice one. If any birds, quote, were to enter the room, I had to throw my drink on them because this was a man's space that was to be protected from invasion by women. I'd actually done it once before and hadn't felt any remorse for it. Only this time, my friend Holly was looking for her friend's birthday party in the student union and was about to enter the wrong room. So I turned to the lads and protested, obviously not realising the double standard, like it mattered that I knew her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But then what happened was, my naivety, it made them more keen because it was a real test now, my allegiance between me and the lads, or my allegiance between me and my female friend. I mouthed sorry to my friend as if that made any sort of difference, and I threw my drink on her. And in that moment, a discomfort arose within me. But what I knew was I turned to the lads and I was getting the social credits that I thought that I deserved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it was easier for me then to swallow that discomfort down and get on with my night and get on with my life. 6 months later, it's very strange, I'm in the exact same room. Obviously this time I'm a second year. The freshers are all stood around us naked because you play rugby at university, you're going to get naked. And one of the senior lads had said to me that I wasn't being hard enough on the freshers. Now, read into that, basically, I wasn't being enough of a bully.
Right.
And I'd never been one. It wasn't something that came naturally to me. Wasn't a weird thing to say, but I wasn't very good at it. And so because I'd been bullied for being fat, one of the freshers had like loose hanging skin around his midriff. And I pointed him out, and I'll never forget the words that I said. I said, "Look how disgusting he is." And I saw the moment that I made another human being feel awful about themselves. And this time I wasn't getting a huge amount of social credit for it because it was just a throwaway comment that nobody had asked me to do. So this same feeling came back that from when I throw my drink on my friend and I felt really uncomfortable. And I couldn't ignore it this time. And so over the course of the next few hours, I left the evening, and over the course of the next few weeks and months, I left the rugby club altogether, 2/3 of the way through my second year. For the next 4 years or so, I was in a bit of flux. And I know that I was changing, but I don't think I knew why. But then 5 years after leaving university, my dad died. And I was in a church in Manchester giving a eulogy at his funeral. And I was feeling a sense of pride that I wasn't crying. I was feeling this twisted sense of achievement that I was managing to contain my emotions on the second saddest day of my life, the saddest obviously being the day that he died. And 3 months later, my friends pulled me out of a cocaine and alcohol mess. I'd been going out every night, taking drugs, drinking, just to not engage with what was going on. And I had a breakdown. Had a full breakdown. And one day I was living with my mate Rob and Daz, and I think there was a rugby match on TV. And I just said to my friend Rob, I was like, "You don't have any plans today, right?" He said, "No." I said, "Right, if it's okay with you, can you just sit there while I pace back and forth and talk?" And I just started talking. And I haven't stopped talking since. I started talking about how I felt. I started talking about what I'd been doing, about how I'd been ignoring everything, about how I'd been buying into this mentality that I had to be okay all the time, and I just haven't stopped. And so once I'd done all of this thinking about myself, and I thought back to all of the stuff that had happened with me and how I'd ended up in that position and whatever, I then went, well, hang on a second, maybe I'm not the only one. Maybe there might be some other guys out there who are experiencing something similar. And then I found out nearly, what was it? Yeah, it must have been, God, my dad died 8 years ago now. 8 years ago I found out that the biggest killer of men under the age of 45 in the UK is suicide. And my tiny brain exploded, and I couldn't unsee it ever again. And that was it. That was it. I was sold.
Yeah.
I knew I had a thing that I was called to do.
If you're enjoying the Mankind podcast, how about taking another step? Now, this one takes some courage. And you have it. Come check out the Men's Work Introduction. It's 3 sessions over 3 weeks. New sessions start every month where you can join other men on the path. Go to bit.ly/menswork1.
Thank you for sharing that story. And Chris and I, when you and I were checking in before we got started recording, I shared a piece of sad news that just emerged in my community today. And I just want to kind of meta point at, I described to you who the man was, someone that I knew, someone I'd sat in men's group with, a little bit about what he was like. And Chris, you didn't say the word. All you just said was it that thing? Mm. And you and I both knew, without saying suicide, was it that thing? And I think right there it is, right?
35-year-old man.
Right there it is. It's like my first fear when I heard he had passed away was, did he kill himself?
Well, statistically, it's the most likely way that he will have died. I know that you don't know how he died yet, and you know, not that there's a good way to die, but I really hope it's not that, but because it's so common amongst men.
Yeah.
It happened.
Thank you.
It happened recently. A really close friend, a mutual friend of mine and my ex, who became a close friend, I was at their wedding, and the man one day just went out and did it. Just, you know, out of the blue. Like, oh, was it really out of the blue? Come on.
Right.
Was it out of the blue? It can't have been. He didn't just decide one day to do it. Something's been going on for ages before that happens. And so I started to talk to men in ways that I'd never spoken to them before. And I started speaking to women without trying to have sex with them. Mm. And I learned so much about how messed up everything is for men, about how messed up these frameworks that are put in place for us are, and how debilitating they are, and how it messed me up. And I started to feel immense levels of shame for my behavior. I felt disgusting, because then once I'd opened that trapdoor, everything came crawling out. All of the mistakes, every crappy piece of behavior that I've ever done. And by the way, that wasn't the end of them. Like, they've continued, because, you know, right. that's not the end. That's not the end. That's the start of the end. All of these things came crawling out.
Thank you.
And it was just like, wow. So not only did it mess me up, it was also messing up other people around me. And they were messing me up and messing themselves up. But I was also affecting women. I was affecting friends. I was affecting partner exes. Like, wow. And it is rancid, some of it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely rancid. The way that we are taught that we have to be, and I say have to, like, we just aren't really given an alternative, because nobody has told us that there is one. Right. Nobody ever told me that there was an alternative way.
Right. And there's real costs for us as boys when we don't fall in line.
Right.
With those structures that are there, that programming that's out there.
Right.
That kind of moves us into a space. Thank you so much. So you said the word, so now I'm just going to leave it in the room and bring it back. So what do you have to say in speaking with other men out there, because there are millions of them who have begun to wake up to these impacts and are hitting that wall of shame that you spoke about?
I used to say that you need to try and absolve yourself as soon as possible, because sitting in that shame doesn't help. And then actually I was called out once, which is brilliant, and I love it when this happens. I was called out by a woman who'd experienced something really bad. And she said, you don't get to say that those men can absolve themselves. And I said, you know what? I hear that. That is fair. So what I say to them now is, don't beat yourself up about it. Acknowledge it and talk about it. Own it, because it was your mistake that you made. So own it. And by owning it, you will learn to understand it. If you dismiss it, you will never understand it. If you absolve yourself of it, I was being a hypocrite because I used to stand on stage and say, like, well, I'm never going to forgive myself for the things that I did, because if I did, I wouldn't be able to do this work that I do. It's just not true, because I am and I have forgiven myself for a lot of the things that I did. But it's that recognition that we're all fallible. Everybody makes mistakes. And what is really interesting, I was speaking to a really great friend of mine, Carolina, recently, and we were talking about boundaries being crossed.
Good.
And she said the most beautiful. I've been doing some work with some 17-year-olds on boundaries the other day. Rather than talking about the idea of consent, let's talk about boundaries, because that's the bigger picture. About this idea that the vast majority of times that lines are crossed and women are made to feel uncomfortable by men, the vast majority of time, the men have absolutely no idea that they have made that person feel uncomfortable until after the event, or perhaps even never that they know. And that is because I a lot of my work is grounded in empathy. Like, the science says that by the time we're 13, 14, boys and girls have a huge empathy gap. Like, there is
Right.
a well-known empathy gap.
Right.
So we're not astute at seeing when we are being slightly coercive, perhaps. We're not astute at recognizing somebody else's minor discomfort around us because we don't have that capability. And so it's to say to those men, like, I am not here to blame you for anything that you have done, okay? The minor things that have happened in your life, a lot of these things, they're not your fault. They are not your fault, but you have to take personal responsibility for them. And that is a difficult kind of square to circle.
Let's cut that line again. So there's a distinction. It's not your fault. It is your responsibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to take personal responsibility for the things that you have done, but also to recognize that a lot of the things that you have done are not a direct result of you being a bastard, because you're not. A lot of the things that you have done are because you have been programmed to think that way, because you have been coerced by, men get coerced too into behaving like that. I often talk to pupils about the fact I had sex at 15 years old. I was terrified of that woman. She not her fault. I didn't even want to take a bra off. Didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have sex again for like 2 years. I did it solely because my friends were pressuring me, and I kind of felt like she was too. So I was coerced into it by the bravado of my mates, of wanting to say that I'm no longer a virgin, but also by this person who wanted to do it. And so I did this thing that I didn't want to do. And so, but some of the awful things, that throwing that drink on that woman is the perfect example of where, like, I didn't want to do it. I turned to the lads and protested. I didn't want to, but that they told me that I had no choice. Of course I had a choice. But it's a microcosm of the bigger picture of where, like, the ramifications for me of not doing it at the time, I felt were worse than the ramifications of doing it, which is mad because what I did was assault somebody.
Yes.
Think about that. Think about how utterly fucked up and twisted that is. That at the time, I didn't recognize that I was just assaulting a friend in order to please the pack.
It's emotion. It's the emotional mathematics of culture that we're always playing with, right? We're weighing costs and benefits. They're not rational costs and benefits.
Right.
They're emotional costs and benefits of the behaviors that we do. And, like, let's be clear with the men out there. If you start calling in your mates on this kind of behavior, you are going to pay a cost.
Yeah.
If you turn your back on this behavior,
yeah,
and do other things and draw boundaries for yourself with people, you will pay a cost. So
Yeah.
talk about the costs and talk about the benefits too. Like, what have you gotten out of this wake up?
Yeah, and the terminology I use to describe that, I use specifically brutal language with it. I call it social suicide.
Yeah.
That's the language that I use. I say to them, what happens to you if you hear a homophobic comment and you're the first one that calls it out? Because that's what they don't call it in, they call it out. If they're the one that goes for the first time, like, why are you doing that? I was like, you get called a pussy, you get called gay, you get called a girl, which, all akin to being feminine, which, to quote Tony Porter, what are we teaching boys about girls if the worst thing that a boy can be called is a girl? One of my favourite quotes.
There you go.
But I said to them, what happens? And they're like, well, then we get picked on, we get bullied. And I'm like, right, you get ostracised, it's social suicide. So it's like, I understand why you don't do it.
Yeah.
But I'm a 34-year-old man who has been openly bisexual for 6 years because I was around people that used casual homophobic language. I used casual homophobic language to fit in. And so I'm an example of where that kept me. And I make the joke now, I missed out on a hell of a lot of fun because of the thing that was going on. And I thought to myself, subconsciously, it was easier for me to repress my bisexuality than it was to call out or call in the homophobic language that was going on around me. And that is the cost-benefit analysis that was going on at the time. And it was only late 20s that I finally was like, Jesus, okay, all right, I'm bisexual, let's go on with it. Like, it wasn't a big deal for me, but it took me that long to actually admit it to anybody.
Yeah.
And these young lads, because I get that. I remember one lad specifically putting his hand up and saying, like, but you don't get it, mate. He's like, we can't do it. He said, the way that you're talking about it makes it sound easy. And I'm like, no, I haven't even said that you should do it. I'm merely just saying that we don't. I'm merely just making the point that we don't. Because the next step is to then do some bystander training and stuff with them about how to intervene and whatever.
Yeah.
But my first thing is just to say, can we acknowledge that we don't? And they go, yeah. And I'm like, right, okay. So you all admit it. At least that's the start.
You see what's going on around you. Yes.
Which is the first step.
Yep. Thank you. So you're kind of multidimensional. You're doing a whole lot of different things and continuing to write and continuing to produce. But we've talked about how a lot of the work that you're doing now is in school systems and working with younger boys in this culture. And talk about, like, how dare you? Like, you behaved in all this arsehole-ish behavior, as you have said. So, like, what gives you the right to talk to these boys? Bring us there.
What gives me the right? Yeah, good question. The fact that nobody else is doing it, and I don't mean nobody else, but the fact that there's just not enough men doing it. The fact that I've spoken to schools. In fact, I was in a school, what day are we on? Thursday. I was in a school on Tuesday. And no, yesterday. Sorry, I was in a school yesterday. And I was chucked in at the deep end. I was supposed to be doing a seminar work with like 20 lads, but I ended up having the entire of year 13. So it was 120 in a room.
Wow.
And I was just supposed to be doing some stuff on sex and consent and boundaries. And they know me because they've heard my talk before. And so I did this thing, like, I kind of made it into a thing somehow. But the head of sixth form came to me afterwards and he said, recently we had a guy in, I'm not going to say his name, who's like a professor, and he'd come in to talk about this sort of stuff. And he's like, the lads just switch off. And he said, there's something about what you do where you break them down at the start. And I said, but I can tell you exactly what that is that I do everything I can to meet them where they are. So I walk into a room, I'll make a joke about how crap something is. I do my talk and I completely debase myself, and I talk about how much of a dickhead I used to be. I swear, I do the things that the teachers don't want me to do. I make some like bravado-ish kind of jokes or whatever. And I also make fun of myself in the way that lads do. And in that way, I know that I get some of them on side. And so what gives me the right to do it is that if you go into a school to talk about drug addiction, who do you get to talk about it? You get a former drug addict. You don't get Dr. Goody Two-Shoes to come in and talk about drug addiction because the kids ain't going to listen. You get the guy to come in and say, you know what, I had some good times on drugs, but you know what, I had some far worse times. And that's all I'm doing. And I kind of see that whole macho, masculine behaviour, that lad culture, as a bit of a drug, and I was addicted for a long time.
Yes.
And so I do it because I'm good at it.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I do it because most times I do it, I get one or two lads who stay behind. And the other day, last week, I had a lad stay behind, and this often happens. He's about to burst into tears, stood in front of me. Sometimes I have time to talk to him, sometimes I don't. This time I didn't, but I convinced his friend, to come into the room with us. And I said, you need to talk about something, yes? He's like, yeah, badly. And I was like, okay, you're his best mate. Are you going to listen to it? This is after my talk. It's like, you're going to listen. Are you going to listen to him? He's like, yeah. And I was like, I'm telling you now, you have no idea how to listen. You have no idea what to say. That's okay. It's okay that you don't. Just go and try now. And I watch them walk out the door, and I see this lad put his arm around his mate and pull him in, and they're going to do it. And so I'm like, that's why I do it. That's the reason that I do it. That's the sole reason. I know I'm not going to save the world. Neither of you and I, Boyson, are going to save the world. But if we incremental change, that one lad, I go home that day and I sit on my sofa here and I just go like, fuck yes, I did that thing today.
Thank you. So as we're getting toward the end here, so I think you just said something really, really important in speaking about talking with young men. And the message is just resonating so loudly for me with any man, any person. Like, you don't know, your mate wants to talk. You're going to listen. You have no idea what you're about to do.
Yeah.
Do it anyway.
Yeah.
It's like, none of us know.
No.
We're just trying.
Yeah. One of the main takeaways that I try to give them is, we talk about strength and toughness and bravery as these bastions of masculinity. And you know what? There is nothing wrong with either of those three. All three of those are a virtue.
Beautiful.
But I make the joke, like, if I do not care one bit how much you can bench press. That is a fluke of biology and spending way too much time in the gym. That's not strength. I was like, you want to be strong? I say to them, the strongest person in this room is the first one of you that intervenes, is the first one of you that speaks up, is the first one of you that says, I'm not okay, is the first one of you that puts his arm around his mate and says, you're not okay. You're the strongest person in this room. And I repeat that 3 times so they hear it. And that's the point. And what they need is, what I'm realizing is that they need to be given permission from another man that it's okay to go and cry with his mate. It's okay to go and sit in the corner and try and help your mate and have no idea how to do it. It's okay to be confused. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to not know what to do right now. It's okay to hate the rhetoric that is going on about men in the media currently. Like, it's okay. You're allowed to feel that. But when you do feel it, let's talk about it. You know? And men, so you have to meet them where they are, and then they really do need to be given permission and challenged, because they love being challenged, right? Mm-hmm. Because so often what happens is, I say, the first one of you in the room that turns to their mate and says, I don't think you're okay. Often I see one of the lads turn to his mate and go, hey mate, I don't think you're okay. And I'm like, I know that you're making a joke, but I'd rather you at least start by joking about it, because at least it normalizes it to some extent.
Yes.
Like, at least you're doing something and not just not talking about it. So, like, and it's also telling them that you're going to fuck this up. Many times. I'm 34 and I've been doing this work for a long time, and I still fuck things up. I still make people feel uncomfortable. You know, I've been called out for sexual harassment as recently as 4 years ago. Like, of course I've sexually harassed people. I'm a 34-year-old man. Like, ludicrous to say that I haven't. Like, and to say that it's okay, you're going to keep making mistakes, but all you can do is try, and that's it.
Keep working, recognize that going back to the empathy gap, recognizing that there's a gap.
Yeah.
And I keep learning, right?
Right.
I'm much more sensitive to the impact that I'm creating on others now than I was a year ago, than I was 5 years ago, than I was 10 years ago, right? Incrementally better at understanding what I'm doing, what I'm creating.
But you must have found that too, right?
Oh, hells yeah. I mean, I identify with you because I've been a shit. I've been an absolute shit. And I'm not off the hook. I've been married 16 years. I still fuck things up in my marriage.
Yeah.
I still mess up with my kids, you know, on the daily. Mm. And I can't even imagine what that would have been like pre the kind of work that I've done.
Right.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
but then maybe you would have been oblivious to the fuck ups.
Correct. And I would have blamed them also.
Right.
You know, it's not my fault, and I take responsibility. I take responsibility for the impact that I'm having.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's beautiful. So what's your last words about how should people catch up to you? What are you doing now? What do you want the action to be from our listeners?
Okay. Oh, well, okay. They're two very different things. The action I want from listeners are, if I could ask them to do one thing, is that if you're listening to this podcast, you're not the target audience for this work. This is a very strange thing to say. True. But if you're already engaged with this, then you're doing it. So it's what I always say to the men, because I do talks and 75% women in the room. So I say, okay, guys, stand up. Okay, how many of you here were brought by a partner? Okay, you sit down. How many of you guys are here on your own? Right, okay. How many of you guys are here with more than one guy? Barely ever anybody. So I'm like, right, all of you men that are here today that are patting yourself on the back for being here, you can have one pat. You get the second pat the next time you go to an event like this, when a woman is talking and you bring a man with you. So to the men who are here today listening to this, share this with some men who don't usually listen to it. Listen to it with them. Keep sending it to them until they listen. Direct them to Boyson's work. Direct them to Tony Porter, to Jackson Katz. Direct them to anyone. I literally don't care if it's me. Direct them to anybody who's doing this work. Graham Goulden in the UK. Find people who are doing this work, engage with them, and then share them with other men. Because too often, and I was having this conversation with somebody today, the men who work in this sphere are isolated. We aren't very good at connecting with each other. We are so few and far between that we need all the support we can. And so what I say to men when I do a talk is, you have my unconditional allyship. Can you pay it back to me and speak to some other organisation that might want to book me? Can you speak to your daughter's school who might want to book me? And as a man, say, I think that this man should do. If you hate me and you don't want me to do it, then obviously don't. But it's like what I say to the lads in the school when I do my first talk. I don't book any additional work until I've done my talk, and then I put the onus on them. And I say, if you want me to come back to this school, you have to tell the staff that. Because I'm not going to come back if you don't. And I mean that. And I stand by that. So every time I get booked for a second or third time by a school, it's because the pupils have asked me to. And so it's about male allyship, because we have to start being allies for each other in this sphere, and not thinking that because we've moved away from the previous sphere that we are now isolated. Because you might be for a time, but there are men out there desperate to have this conversation. And you know what the best thing you can do right now if you're in the UK, or actually anywhere, go on my Twitter account, @Hemmch, HEMMCH, click on the people that I'm following, and the last 50 people, basically, that I'm following, I'm only following people now in this sphere. That's it. And follow them, and engage with them, and support them, and retweet them, and give them the props that they deserve. The guy who takes 5 lads on a walk every night at 7 p.m. in London, who I need to go meet at some point soon. Like, he's the hero. He's an absolute hero to me, and he doesn't know that I exist, and I don't think. And I don't think that he knows that I think he's a hero. But at some point, I'll meet him, and I will call him a hero, because he is. And so we have to start being better allies for each other. And by better allies, I don't mean making sure that we get good jobs and whatever and all that crap that's easy. I mean the stuff that's difficult.
Thank you. This has been the Mankind Podcast. I've been here with Chris Hemmings this afternoon. Chris, this has been really great conversation, and I hope and intend, yes, I will keep shouting you out on my Twitter account and on the Mankind Podcast, Mankind Project Twitter account, and I hope we'll talk again.
I really do hope so. And when I set up mine, I will get you on.
There you go.
That's how it works.
Thanks all. I hope you enjoyed the episode. So a couple of key takeaways that I took away is start talking, start listening about the real stuff, and don't stop. Just do it. Just start talking about it. That is strength. That is like a way of revolutionizing the world. Own your impacts. Work for self-forgiveness. Work for accountability. Do the healing work you need to be able to do to see and own the impacts of your behaviors. And what I think is so beautiful and so empathetic and compassionate, you don't have to know what to do next. It's okay. Normalize making mistakes as men and being willing to just like wrap our arms around our brothers and say, hey man, what's going on? I don't know what's going to happen here, but I'm willing to talk. So, and Chris's call to action for you all is find him on Twitter. HEMMCH on Twitter. Follow the people that he follows. See the link to his website there. Learn more about how he is working with boys and young men in schools in the UK, and keep coming back. Thank you.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodgson, producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim Donovan and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.